Graphistas, hello and welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning. Happy to see you. Hope you're all safe wherever you are. My name is Florent. I work in the drivers team. And today I'm going to conclude the series on Spring Data Neo4j. So it's been a long ride. I guess at least 9 or 10 weeks, if not more. And as last week, I tried to show you the newest feature of Cypher DSL and failed because there was a bug in there that I couldn't anticipate. I will wrap this up today. So show finally, because my awesome colleagues fixed that right after I reported the issue. So I will be able to show you the Cypher DSL feature I wanted to show you last week. And then I'm going to talk about something a bit different, still related to Spring Data Neo4j, of course, which is about migrating from Spring Data Neo4j 5/Neo4j OGM to Spring Data Neo4j 6, because those, also the names are quite common. They don't share much. There are significant changes from 5 to 6, so it's important to know them and to act accordingly, because you might be in the situation where you already have a Spring Data Neo4j 5 application and want to migrate the Neo4j server and the application as well to the latest version. So I'm going to cover that as well. So I planned to have this session a bit longer than usual, 1 hour and a half. We'll see. If I don't need that much, I won't take that much. We'll see how it goes, but that's going to be the last stream on Spring Data Neo4j, and in the upcoming weeks, I'm going to resume the live stream series I did with Eric Solander, City of Mindstand, and maintainer of GoGM or GoGM, which is Node.jm, so object graph mapper, just like Spring Data Neo4j is, but written in Golang. And funnily enough, this OGM is actually inspired from Spring Data Neo4j 5 OGM, which I'm going to talk about today. So, as usual, if you have any questions, of course, ask them right in the chat. Even if it's not completely related to Spring Data Neo4j, I will do my best to react in a timely manner and try to provide you with some pointers. If I know enough about the topic, else I might redirect you to people more suited and more knowledgeable about the matter you address. All right, so let me share my screen. And as usual, before we dive into the code, a few announcements. If you've been following this series, you already know that Nodes 2021 is happening in the middle of June, 17th of June. So the CFP is closed, so it's too late to submit proposals for talks, but we would be super delighted to see you attend and join the discussion, attend the talks, learn about experience from various people from various domains. So please, please, please save your spot there before it's too late and enjoy a nice edition, also virtual, a nice edition of Nodes. On a more personal note, I'm also co-running an event called Hack Commit Push. And this here is going to be virtual again, just like last year, unlike 2 years ago. And the idea is to have a 1 day long open source hackathon. There will be Neo4j projects. There will be a free training in the morning for people who want to learn more before contributing. But basically, the idea is you've got projects represented by people, and you will work with these people towards your first contributions to this open source project. So here is a batch currently published. There are more to come, including Neo4j related projects that's in discussion. And also, tickets are already available. It's happening on Saturday, so I know Saturday is not always convenient for everyone, but sometimes it's easier, like if you're a student or if you've got strong work constraints, that's something you can hopefully manage. So we would be super happy to see you and maybe become a regular open source contributor. So this is a golden opportunity because you will work with open source project maintainers directly. You will get guidance from them. Their mission during that day is to make you successful in crafting your first contribution. So we would be so happy to see you there. just go, and I'm going to send the link in the chat. Just go to paris2021.hack-commit-pu.sh, and you will be able to find everything you need to know about the event. So let me first send the Notes 2021 link. I'm writing in the chat right now. Commit push link, and then we'll get back to business, talking about Cypher DSL. Cool. And before I do that, small announcement, you might have seen it already. So if you're a user of Slack, like we have this Neo4j user Slack. So if I show it real quick, we used to have this one called Neo4j users.slack.com. But we are moving to Discord, so that way we won't have limited history, limited archive of messages, etc., etc. So everything is moving there. So if you have any questions, you've got forget about Slack, basically, forget about this Slack, and move to Discord for live questions. And as usual, since that hasn't changed, you also have community.neo4j.com, and for development-related questions, Stack Overflow is also a great place because it's monitored by many people at Neo4j and outside Neo4j as well. So yeah, just keep in mind that that the Slack instance for the community one will be retired very soon. So if you don't have a discord.com account yet, now it's time to create it. That being said, let's move to our beloved Neo4j driver admin project. So if it's the first time you join this session, Neo4j driver admin is about an application with a Spring Boot, Spring Data Neo4j backend, and an Angular frontend. And the idea is to help me input new projects. So part of my activity as a driver teammate is to do some community outreach that I inherited from my DevRel activities back when I was a DevRel team member. And one of the things I do is explore basically different projects written in different language to connect to Neo4j. So this is currently, I have a list of projects that I monitor that is written in a Google Doc file. So it's not super fancy, not super high tech. But I really would like to actually feed that data into a graph database. And I was thinking, hey, why not create a simple user interface to just input the data, update it maybe at some point, and that way it will connect to a Neo4j database and send the data there. And so that's what I started. Obviously, it would take me much longer because 1 hour every week is not much to develop an application. So the front-end part, I dedicated two streams to it a couple of weeks ago. Without much success, I had a blocker, and I haven't found time to work on that blocker, but it's almost there. It's very basic, but almost there. The backend is doing basic mapping as well. So just to show you what I have connectors. Connectors as technical ID. Actually, this is optional, by the way, because it's Spring Data knows that it's UUID, so it knows it needs to use the UID generator. But sometimes I like to be explicit. URI is like a GitHub URI to the project, GitLab, or what have you. Official, whether it's an official connector or not. By official connector, I mean something like the drivers, like the Bolt drivers. So speaking the Bolt protocol, so the Java, JavaScript, Golang, .NET, and Python. So 5 of them. And what kind of transport it supports, like, well, does it support Bolt? Does it support HTTP? And for Bolt, what kind of version does it support? Is it 4.3, 4.2, 4.1, 4.0, all of them, etc., etc. So I have a very basic graph at the moment. And I have a tiny API on top of it based on Spring MVC. I mean, nothing too fancy here, quite classic. I just called the repository that saves a driver. So I have a persistence endpoint to save a driver from the front end. So I have a basic form in my user interface where I input all this information and send it to the backend, save it to the graph database, and that's good to go. So that's cool. So that's what we had so far. And now, so I started with Cypher DSL 2 weeks ago. And last week was kind of a nightmare because I hit a bug that I didn't expect and I could not really anticipate it anyway. And so I wanted to show you newest feature of Cypher DSL called static metamodels. But first, let me show you what we have so far. So if I go to this connector repository, I'm taking the bare minimum Spring Data interface, which is repository. So by default, if you just extend that, it does not expose any read or write operations. Whereas if I take, for instance, CRUD repository, I would automatically expose all of that to my project. Here, because I need only one thing and one at a time, I've taken the approach of exposing things explicitly. So if I take, so save is basically a copy from the save of CRUD. So it might be somewhere here. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's generic, of course, at this location, but in my case, the T is my connector because I'm dealing with connectors, SNTR connectors. So save, and that's it. And that way, Spring Data will generate the operation. But one thing I added the other 2 weeks ago is this extra interface. So that's a fragment, that's a repository fragment. And what does it do? You expose whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. What matters is whatever the name is. So let's say I have this fragment, the interface called X. I need to have an implementation with the same name, so X and IMPL as a suffix. That's the only naming convention you need. And based on that, once basically Spring Data instantiates your repository instance, it will make sure to automatically find the implementation and aggregate it to the rest of the operations. And so in that case, what I did 2 weeks ago was using like a simple implementation. This is managed by Spring, so I don't need to have any component here, for instance. This is automatically considered a bin because it's aggregated through Spring Data mechanism. So that's why I don't have any auto-wired. I mean, auto-wired is optional when you have a single constructor. That's one of the new changes in Spring framework. I mean, not that new, but. And so all of this is managed by, like you would do for any class managed by Spring framework. And then here is my implementation. So here we're using Cypher DSL. So the goal of Cypher DSL, if you don't know about it, is to provide a type-safe, DSL, so domain-specific language, exposing Cypher to express Cypher queries. Because, right, if you look usually, I mean, here it's not a best example, but sometimes you could do queries like this. Like, I mean, I'm just going to do something stupid. That's a string, right? And so strings, when you get complex queries, are easy to mess up. Obviously, this can be caught by integration test, but the sooner you can have feedback, the better. So what's better than having a compiler error if you write an invalid statement? So that's basically the goal of a Spring Data Neo4j. So here, I don't know, I'm just going to do... I mean, that's not going to work, right? Because 42 is in no way related to my connector, so that's a bit stupid. But just to show you, yeah, I could do instead something. Maybe let's put it here, even if that doesn't make any sense. That's still strings. So they are fundamentally strings with all the problems that string have. String as a type does not bring too much information. It could be a book, as far as I'm concerned. It could be a first name or last name. It could be anything. And it could contain typos that would not be detected until runtime. So Cypher DSL lets you build, hopefully, I would say, I'm not sure, maybe there are some very strange edge cases when you could have something that compiles and that generates an invalid Cypher query. But the goal, at least, is to avoid that as much as possible. So what I had 2 weeks ago is a simple method through this fragment mechanism, through this repository fragment mechanism, with a custom implementation, and using Neo4j template, which not only supports, so if we have a look real quick, not only supports the standard stuff with strings, like I could say, hey, please find all the connectors, and have some parameters, or you could also do some other things like count, and then you give the query I'm not very inspired today, so I'm just using the same query again and again. But it supports strings, obviously, but you can see it also supports statement. And statement is a Cypher DSL type, which represents a valid Cypher statement that you build step by step with Cypher DSL. And so in my case, I wanted to find all the connectors that match a specific language and a specific transport. Let's say, for instance, I'm interested in all the Java projects I have identified so far in my database, which supports Bolt. And so, of course, there is no, it's done, the implementation, if we look at it, and we'll come back to that, is a bit quick and dirty, because we're just using the property URI, like if there is Java in the name, then we assume that it's a Java project, which is, of course, not ideal. But we could use GitHub API, to extract some statistics on the repository and see what's a dominant language here. But that wouldn't even be perfect, right? Maybe it's mostly a Java project, and there are tons of metadata file written in YAML or what have you, and then it would say it's a YAML project. I don't know, but it would probably be slightly better than just relying on the language appearing in the URI. But anyway, that just, for the sake of example. And so what do? I do a match. So I start with match, which is defined, as far as I know, on the Cypher class. So the entry point is Cypher.match, but I did a static import. And then what kind of pattern am I looking for? I'm looking from one node connected to another. So connector, relationship to transport. And actually, like I said last week, I could specify the type if I want to. And so for that, I would have to look at my entities, and it's through the support relationship type. So okay, so that's a bit better, right? At least I precise not only the direction, because it's from to, there is to here, but also the type. And so I'm matching connector to transport. And what's connector? Connector is a node with a label connector, and I give in a variable name for the query. Transport is the same, it's a node with a transport label. I give it a variable name here. And so match would basically be something like this. Match, C, connector, support. That's the equivalent, basically. That's what I'm building gradually here. Support T, transport. So that's a DSL in Java that allows me to express the same thing, but without all of the issues of building strings by hand. Then I've got where, and where I can express predicates. So here my property URI, which is a property of connector, must contain the parameter language, and I can probably do some lowercase stuff, but we can check later. Again, that's more for the sake of having an example than for the correctness of it. So that would be something like c.uri contains, I'm just making this up, language, because it's a parameter that I define here. And t, because trans is at the variable names, right? Named c and t.value equals transport, something like this. And then I would return c. That's, if I move this over here, that would be the query generated for me. And the nice thing is, of course, we can still make mistakes in the property names, in the parameter names, in the labels, but it reduces the surface of problems quite a lot. At least, the query might not behave as we expect because of these smaller mistakes, but syntactically they should be valid anyway. That's already a giant leap forward compared to manually managing strings. So that's what we got. However, you can see we could go even further if you think about it. Why? Because we already defined all this kind of information with Spring Data Neo4j 6, right? We have this entity. So this node here, we know the primary label is this one. We know it has an ID property, URI, official. It has a support relationship connected to several nodes through this relationship here. So target node is connected transport. this relationship as a versions property. Transport is a simple node as well, with a transport label with value which is as simple as HTTP or bold, etc., right? And even, of course, here the example is quite small, so the example might feel a bit contrived, but I had to look up, right? I had to go back and forth between my entity to remember the relationship type, for instance, of the label. So because there is some back and forth, that's kind of an indicator that there is some kind of duplicated information here. What if I decide to change the label? Obviously, I would come here first because my model lives here. It's modeled through Spring Data Neo4j constructs. But I might forget to do this, to change it here. And then I would obviously test to catch it, but we can do better than that. And that's the whole idea. That's the whole idea of the static meta model with Cypher DSL. You can build it by hand, which is something we are not going to do. So you can do this by hand if you're not using Spring Data Neo4j 6. But because we are using Spring Data Neo4j 6, and it happened that the Cypher DSL maintainers and the Spring Data Neo4j 6 maintainers are one and the same, because Cypher DSL was actually born out of a need for Spring Data Neo4j 6, there is a specific integration there. So for that, we need the latest Cypher DSL here, which is nice. And we will need to add something else, which I haven't added. And let's look at the doc real quick, just to add this. So if we go to, oops, I'm not sure where I'm typing here. Let me have a look at the chat, we never know. So if we look at the documentation, oops, wrong one, or is it? No, it's not the wrong one. So here we have the docs. And today I'm talking about static meta model, as I was telling you. So you can use the first part basically is how to build it manually, but I'm not really interested in that. I want to use this. This basically will allow me to generate the static meta model from the Spring Data Neo4j 6 information. And that information is encoded as annotation. And in Java, you have what we call annotation processes that you can configure at compile time, and the compiler will do its job and then delegate to extra annotation processes if there are any. And to do that, the best way is to configure the compiler explicitly, because that way you're using the processor only for that step, only for that specific plugin. You don't pollute your class path. You can, of course, add it to the class path as well, and then it will be automatically invoked as well, but that's a bit dirtier. So let's be explicit. Actually, I'm gonna probably take all of this. Just the version needs to be extracted. So I'm using already one of the latest version of Cypher DSL with the fix. So the problem we had last week should be gone. Actually, I tested it, so it is gone. I'm quite confident in saying that it is gone. So not only do we need the Spring Boot Maven plugin, but then I will add the explicit configuration here. And this one is, let's align those. And extract. So same as refactoring, extract variables, that's the same shortcut. So Cypher DSL.version, then it will detect there is a second one. Here, yes, replace all, boom. Okay, here we go. So now I'm gonna just build this real quick. It should fetch, I'm not gonna run the tests. Okay, it's fetching everything I need. Okay. So actually, what I only needed to do is Maven compile. That was actually enough. Because I just need to trigger compilation, because compilation will so clean just to force it. I mean, there is no need, but just to show you that something is going on. And so if we look, what happens under the hood, I just with this change, right? It's tiny. I just added the annotation processor, and already I should see a difference. And let me tell you how. So if we go to target classes, which is where, generated sources first, because the annotation processor can generate sources, and these sources will be in turn compiled by the Java compiler. And you can see that there are those based on my package name, right? So which is com Neo4j connectors. And in that case, I have 3 generated classes, and let's have a look at them a little bit. So that's what you would have written by hand, basically, and that's what something we don't want to do because the information is already there. So thanks to the annotation processor, we don't have to deal with any of this. So you can see we have a connector which node-based, so basically because it represents a node. So that's your metamodel for a class that is mapped to a node in the graph. You can, if you want to, define properties, so you have shorthand ways to access them in your queries. And basically it does everything for you. So it declares auto properties for you, it extends the right class, etc., etc. And then if we look, same here. We have transport, connector transport, which comes from this one, which is yet another entity mapped to a node. So we have a static metamodel here. And we have connector transport because yeah, let me check real quick. Yeah, you have a kind of singleton you can access to. And here there is not much else because there is the ID. So we should see it somewhere, I guess. We'll see about that. And then it also generates a relationship metamodel. So it's a bit more complex because you don't necessarily know the types around the relationship. So sometimes it has to be, but so it's between the connector and connector transport, and the type is support. And again, it does all the writing for us. So let's try to use that model now, that's generated meta model for us. So all I've done so far is add this annotation processor, and it did the job of generating the source code, and then in turn the compiler continues and generates those. So we can see it's been generated in the bytecode here. So far, so good. And so let's try now to replace what we had before. And so I guess we could do, oops, something like this. Or can't I? Mistook. Except it should create field at Maven dependency. Oh, do I need to? Let me just do one thing. IntelliJ needs to understand that source are generated now. So I guess the only thing I need to do is reload project so that the Maven metadata is refreshed. And now it knows the annotation processing is on. Hopefully that should, yes, okay. Connector. And then I can name it again C if I want to. And just, I'm gonna add static imports because that's a bit better. And see, now I don't have to deal with the label. I don't have to remember it, which is great, which is exactly the kind of things I don't want to deal with. And that is generated based on my existing entities. So everything is derived from my actual model, and I don't have to think twice about duplicating information. So that's great. And then we can probably check this. We have connector URI, so that should exist. URI, yes, perfect. And property value. So here, I hope it works because I have not seen value in the generated code. Nope. So that's something that might be a slight bug again. So for now, I'm gonna do this, which is not great. So for some reason, the annotation processor missed one field. So I will have to double check with my colleagues what that is. So we can see that in the connector case, it picked up the ID properly. So the one with this annotation. But in the case of the connector transport, which doesn't have any generated value, so connected transport, it's an ID, but the value is managed manually because it's only either HTTP or bolt. We don't need any other value. So that's why it's not generated. For some reason, there is no generated. That's why I was puzzled when I first read it a few seconds ago. So yes, that might be. It's quite new. I mean, it's been released last week, the latest fix. So yeah, it's still quite new, but it's already, even if it's partial, it's already doing a good job, in my opinion. So yeah, ideally here there would be some kind of container connector transport dot value, but it's not there yet. So yeah, probably a tiny issue with the annotation processor, but that's okay. That can happen. And so let's see real quick. I believe we have a test for this, and the test leaves not. So yeah, one approach if you want to run integration test. I tried 2 weeks ago to test a fragment in isolation, but that does not make many sense, right? Because the way you use it is through the connector repository, because it implements that interface. So you can call it, and if Spring Data will weave the fragment to the main generated implementation. And so if I look, I have this find by language in transport already written. I mean, it's just a kind of refactoring, so I don't need to new test. I just need to check that it still runs. So here I'm using as usual, test containers and the Spring Boot test support. So I have a container here for Neo4j. I configure the application on the fly with this dynamic property registry thing based on the container, and then I run the test. And hopefully it should still pass. Oops, okay, except it does not. So that was unexpected. What's going on? Let's see. Invalid data, variable. Oh, right. Yes, okay. Yes, that's my mistake. That's actually my mistake because it should be connector because I named it. Ah, but except I lose. That's interesting. Okay, so let's forget about the names. And instead, so we actually don't need those. Yeah, let me get rid of this. Actually, that's in that case, the issue is not with the annotation processor, but with me. And so what we want to do is this. Now that should work, because it should generate a single, I mean, I hope, a single variable name. Else it might be something to be refined as well. Again, it's kind of new, so. But yeah, you shouldn't be shy from using new things, because if nobody uses them, then we never know the issues it has and it cannot improve. So be brave sometimes and try. Okay, so it's still complaining. Let's look at the generated queries that causes problems. Oh yeah, it's generated different variables every time. Okay. Huh, that's interesting. That is interesting. Yeah, it does not make, yeah, so I will have to check. Maybe that's something I missed, or maybe it's documented. Let's see, because that's a possible trap that one can fall into. And let's see an example, movie title, ascending. Yeah. What about something a bit bigger? Person born, person born. Let's see. Oh yeah, no, okay, I know the issue. So let me go back to what I had. The only problem here is I should use connector. Oh, I keep putting the underscore in the wrong place. That's what I should do. And then I should do this. That way because yes, there are nodes in the Cypher DSL sense, but also I'd rather use a concrete type so I can have access to the concrete properties of those. And in that case, there is no value as we would like. So that's something to investigate. But Now it should work better because connector is still named C, transport is still named T, and I don't lose the type information actually, so that's great. That's generic done right. So thank you, dear colleagues. And if I run this again, hopefully this time the test will pass. Because I'm using a stable name for the variable and I'm reusing that all over the query. So that should be good enough. So that's why I wanted to take 1 hour and a half, because we never know when we have unexpected stuff that happens. I plan to use 30 minutes and it's already 35 past. So I did well to take some wiggle room, and now it works. So yes, small gotcha. Of course, you have to use the concrete types if you want to continue accessing the concrete properties. That makes sense, but you know, sometimes I make silly mistakes. Cool. So now let's switch gears completely, and I'm going to talk about a related topic, but quite unrelated to the application I'm doing. Because yeah, I didn't duplicate my project to write it in SDN5 OGM. I didn't go that far, but I have another project I want to show you, and I want to highlight some of the important aspects of migrating from Spring Data Neo4j OGM to Spring Data Neo4j6. So let me first sit down, because I've been standing for an hour straight, and I'd rather sit down a bit now. And then let me change the title, because it's not Cypher DSL anymore. It's about a migration, so from SDN5 OGM to SDN6. All right, and yay, here we go. So let's remove this. Now we are done with our metamodel. There is a tiny issue, but I will first investigate and then open an issue if needed. So thank you, Cypher DSL. It was great meeting you. So and you don't have to use it with Spring Data Neo4j, by the way, if you don't use it. So if you don't need SDN, you can still use Cypher DSL. It's great. And there is even some interop with Query DSL, so that's even greater. And let's move to Spring Data 5 Neo4j6 migration. And to set things a bit clear, let me show you what I mean when I talk about this. So what's Spring Data and what's Neo4j, or what's Spring Data Neo4j5 and what's OGM? So let's start maybe with Neo4j OGM. I'm gonna Google it like everyone does. So Neo4j OGM is a library. It's a library, it's a standalone library. There is no adherence to Spring. It works well with Spring projects, but you don't have to use Spring Framework. It works well with Java Enterprise Edition products. So yeah, that's a standalone library exposing object graph mapping capabilities, like the one we've seen with Spring Data Neo4j6. Like you can have node entities, relationship entities, and you also have standalone things like similar to Hibernate, if you know Hibernate a little bit, like session factories, sessions, etc., etc. And so I can give you a quick example, quick live coding example of OGM. I mean, it's going to be very basic, but just to give you a taste of what it can be. And then I will talk about migration. So let's spend the next 10-15 minutes just talking about OGM and see how we can get started with it. Also, again, you should not start with this if you start a new project. Use Spring Data Neo4j6 directly, unless you have specific needs, and I will come back to that. So one of the things you need to understand is Spring Data Neo4j5 was built upon Neo4j OGM. So it was delegating a lot of mapping logic to Neo4j OGM. And Spring Data Neo4j5 and OGM were included by default when you went to start.spring.io, for instance, which is Spring Initializer. When you wanted to add Neo4j, so you would type Neo4j, then you would add your metadata, generate, download the project, and get started. You would get Spring Data Neo4j5 OGM by default with up until Spring Boot 2.3. So like if you pick 2.3.9 currently, which is the latest release of Spring Boot 2.3, you would still get Spring Data Neo4j 5. If you pick the latest Spring Boot, which is currently 2.4, then you will get Spring Data Neo4j 6. And just to make things extra explicit, Spring Data Neo4j 6 does not use Neo4j OGM at all. So Neo4j OGM is a standalone object graph mapping library that has been used by Spring Data Neo4j up until version 5. Version 6, which is the current major, does not use it at all. And you get Spring Data Neo4j 5 and OGM up until Spring Boot 2.3 by default, emphasis on by default. If you pick the current Spring Boot, which is 2.4, or if you're feeling adventurous, 2.5, which is currently in milestone, you would get Spring Data Neo4j 6. And there are no dependency from Spring Data Neo4j 6 to OGM. There are ways to use Spring Data Neo4j 5 OGM with the latest Spring Boot, but again, that's not recommended, so I'm not even going to show it. You can try if you really, really need to, but you should first and foremost try to migrate to Spring Data Neo4j 6, and that's what I'm going to cover next. Because I'm a bit lazy, you can actually use a curl script, which does the same as clicking on 2.3.9, adding some information. In that case, I just leave the default metadata. And so what this script does, so maybe move this here, I'm just going to download the default, which is Spring Data Neo4j 5, because I'm using 2.3.9 for Spring Boot. So I'm just going to run this. So here I have a project, happy, and I'm going to start just showing you not the Spring Data Neo4j part, but mostly the Neo4j OGM part, which is included in the class path. So that's a lazy way to use Neo4j OGM. So let me do this. I need to open the right project. So again, for some reason, IntelliJ doesn't want me to use Command V. I have to do it like this. So if I go there, I'm going to import the project in IntelliJ. And I'm just going to show you a very basic example of Neo4j OGM. I'm not going to use Spring Data Neo4j 5 capabilities. So the way it works, so let's forget even about Spring Boot, because again, I'm not even interested in Spring Boot here or any Spring stuff, just Spring Data Neo4j. So what I can do is, sorry, switching about between windows, but just want to check something real quick. And I currently have a Neo4j desktop open with one project and one database, which is Neo4j admin. So I have an active local graph connection, which is somewhere here. And as you can see, if I run, I mean, hopefully you see it. If I run my database, I only have 2 nodes currently. I mean, there are liquid-based nodes, but I'm not going to talk about those. Transport nodes, HTTP and Bolt, which is part of what I insert with Liquibase, but that's something I'm going to talk a bit about soon. Okay, so I have these 2 nodes, label transport, properties called values. That's quite simple. Let me move this around. And if I want to get started with Neo4j OGM, what I can do is use the graph database stuff. That's using the driver API, actually. That's right into the. So for now, I'm going to use a raw API, like I would do if I use a Java Bolt driver directly. I can give it a URI. So in my case, I'm going to keep it simple. It's a simple Bolt connection, or no routing needed. It's a basic authentication, so no fancy stuff. With a very secure username and password. Of course not, so don't do this at home. Encode that in our environment variables or secrets or what have you, depending on your platform. So that's so far, that's what you would write with a simple Java program using the driver. So actually, we could wrap this because there should be one driver instance per application so that it is closed automatically. That's cool. So as I was telling you, OGM is inspired from Hibernate in some way. So you've got what we call a session factory. So if I create this by hand, you would need to give it a driver instance as here. You can optionally give it some package. So let's say, in that case, that would be code.example.demo. Also, there is still nothing there. And so driver in that case is actually a slight abstraction on top of the Java driver. Because one important thing to understand is, so if you look at this, this is part of, if we look at the package real quick, it's part of Neo4j OGM, right? That's not the Java driver anymore. And why do we have this? Because if you look at different implementations, we also have, I mean, I might not have it here, but let's see. Yeah, I only have Bolt by default, but you can have the embedded stuff, which is not supported by Neo4j, Spring Data Neo4j 6, by the way. So that's, if you really need an embedded database, it might be a good reason to stick to Spring Data Neo4j 5, Neo4j OGM. Although there are some ways to make Spring Data Neo4j 6 work with an embedded database, but I'm not going to show that. So that's why you've got this abstraction on top of drivers. You've got HTTP, Bolt, and embedded, whereas Spring Data Neo4j 6 considers the only Bolt, which makes sense because that's kind of the de facto important transport that is well supported. So I've got this session factory. At some point, I guess I can close it, right? Yeah, so I can wrap it. Also, I'm not using the same try block because they have different lifetimes. Oh, except it's not auto-closable. What? Okay, too bad. And then you can open sessions and everything. So you have some kind of cache then that will be built for your session that will maintain some kind of, graph metadata in that cache and try to map that to your model. So you can open a session. You can just open this and you can run stuff and begin transactions, delete stuff, etc., etc. And you could, for instance, load something. In my case, I'm just gonna load every transport.classes, which does not exist yet, contrary to what it tries to pretend. Create class transport, some example demo, and we'll come back to it. And that should give me a collection of transport. And for now, I'm gonna do something very simple. I'm just gonna print them basically. So that's a very simple Neo4j OGM program here. So of course, now I need to define a model. So that's going to look very similar to Spring Data Neo4j 6, right? So you have this node entity, which is Neo4j OGM, right? It's not Spring Data Neo4j 5. Spring Data Neo4j 5, you can see it more or less as a springification, if I should say, some kind of spring wrapping for Neo4j OGM. So I think you can give it, yes, it's label. I mean, I'm going to just use transport, which is the default, so I don't really need to be explicit like that, but, Then I've got an ID, which will just going to be, again, so here I'm going to be cheating, and I'm going to do that. Hopefully that will work. I mean, I could actually also do, there is internal ID, internal node ID, and property. So by default, every property is persisted. And then I can just generate a getter and setter, or you can use Lombok if you like hacky projects. And yes, spoiler alert, I'm not a fan of Lombok. And you can generate two strings just so we can have some nice display in our main project. So if you want to be super explicit, you can use property, which is again Neo4j OGM annotation, and the name should be value. If I try to run this, hopefully it will not crash on me. So I'm configured to point it to my local database currently running. Yeah, which I showed before, and I should be able to. There are two transport nodes, one for HTTP, one for Bolt. So I should see all of those. So let's see real quick. Okay, it failed as usual. Why would I succeed in the first try, right? That would be unheard of. Connection to the database terminated. Authentication failure. Did I change the password somehow? It might be. Let me check real quick. Except I got rid of it, didn't I? Let me try this just in case. I mean, it's not super important, but no, okay. So let me change the password. I mean, it's a local database anyway, so I can do what I want to it. And there is this, I believe, hello, I believe there is capability reset DBMS password. So I'm just gonna apply this, apply, restart, and then we'll be able to. So that's quite neat. We don't do that in production, but I don't think people use Neo4j desktop in production unless they use their local environment. But here, that's quite handy when my memory fails me. And so yeah, let's wait for the restart. It is, or is it? No, it's still waiting. I've seen it fail, so I'm half serene about it, half stressed, because it would not be the first time that something fails unexpectedly with me. Okay, it works. So now the password should be fine. And let's see. So you can see there is a request, and we can see we have indeed the transport we wanted. So that's a very simple example, but that gives you an idea of Neo4j OGM concepts. One difference as well in that you also have top-level relationship entities, which is something that does not quite exist in Spring Data Neo4j 6, right? If I maybe I should reopen just to contrast it with the project we have. But if we look, for instance, at how we model so connection transport, so that's a node, but we have relationship properties, but that does not make it an entity, right? That's not a top-level concept. That's just a way to aggregate some common properties and not target. And you could reuse it in different contexts, actually. So that's quite useful and a bit more powerful than top-level relationship. Because top-level relationship in Neo4j OGM, I'm just going to write a fake one. Just to show a little bit, it's fixed. The types at start and end are fixed, whereas in Spring Data Neo4j 6, only the target is fixed. So I don't know, I'm just gonna write some rel. You can have relationship entity. So again, that's a Neo4j OGM annotation. You can give it a type if you want to, as it will be derived from the class name. Rel, and then you have start node. In that case, I'm just going to do something stupid, which would be a node entity type, a start, and then you could have extra property if you want to. So very useful model, of course, and yeah. So and then of course you would have to generate everything else, and you would need an ID, I believe. In that case, I'm just going to be lazy and use. Yeah, actually, I should have done that, right? Yeah, no, yeah. So something like this, plus getters, setters, etc., etc. So that's a bit different. That's a top-level entity. In Spring Data Neo4j 6, there is no top-level entity, and so you don't have, contrary to Spring Data Neo4j 5, you don't have repositories for relationships. That does not exist anymore, because the central concept, and it's actually true. when you match something with Cypher, you always start from a node. You don't start with just relationships. You need to specify some pattern of nodes. So Spring Data Neo4j in a way, philosophy is much closer to Cypher philosophy and Cypher model than Spring Data Neo4j. Spring Data Neo4j is trying to cover more use cases more broadly, and so of course that's make it harder to maintain and sometimes has some obscure feature that are collide against each other. So for instance, if I take one thing that I still don't understand very well because I've not used it much, but when you want to, sorry, not in Session Factory, but I have a session that I should close at some point, I think. When you load something, you can also, let me check somewhere over the rainbow. You have paging, of course, etc., but that's not what I want to show. Let me check real quick. Check my notes. Session save and session load, right? Session save and session load. I could say, please load this transport. I'm just going to do something stupid here. And with some depth. Except I don't find it anymore. So 3, 2. There was, let me check real quick. Yeah, no, okay, here it is. So that's the second one. And so you need to give, let me check. Yeah, sorry, I'm mistaking transport of class as a type, the ID, which would be whatever. And then you can say how much, based on that start node, how far you want to go. So that's a load depth. By default, it's 1, which means it's going to fetch the transport and its direct neighbors. It could be -1, so go as deep as needed. So neighbors of neighbors of neighbors of neighbors. So you could end up with a very, very big cache of your graph in memory. So you could blow up your memory usage because of this. It's only useful if you have like very deep but not very wide graph structures. And so similarly, you have the same, so it's called the load depth, or load horizon, or you can call it whatever you like. So that's a nice optimization. But in my opinion, it's only an optimization, and you should not use it unless you know what you're doing. And especially if you start to mix different depths in the same session, then it might be messed up because you might have retained more objects than the ones that are flushed, and then you could end up with data loss or unexpected results. It makes things much, much harder to reason about. So if you have a Spring Data 5 or Neo4j OGM application, double check what you're doing if you're using depths, custom depths for load or save or both, because those are useful for optimization, but only for that. And if you can find an alternative, like a custom query on your repository that does the job well, use that. Don't use load depths or save depths. In my opinion, it's hard to understand, it's hard to reason about, it's hard to maintain, so don't use it. And anyway, it's gone. It's completely gone from SDN6, so you're not going to have that. And so similarly, as I was saying, you could save a specific entity with a specific depth, and that also can be tricky because you're not going to save by default the whole graph attached to that specific entity, but you could save less, etc., etc. And so yeah, that could lead to unexpected results. So I'm personally not a big fan of it. I've not really used Spring Data Neo4j before, so there might be valid use cases, but in my opinion, it looks more like an optimization than a real, like the default go-to thing you want to use. So if you have some custom depths like that, double check them, make sure you understand them, make sure there is no alternative to that, because that's going to make your migration to Spring Data Neo4j much, much harder. If you can use custom queries, go the custom query way. If you can afford to load everything or save everything, do that. Because sometimes we optimize without concrete reasons, without any measurements. So if you can avoid this, and if there is no bad impact, just go for it. But yeah, try to find an alternative. So in short, you've got Session Factory with a tiny abstraction over the transport, because Spring Neo4j OGM supports both HTTP and embedded, whereas Spring Data Neo4j6 only supports both. And then you've got Sessions Factory, like in Hibernate, which then can create session. And then you've got all the usual operation in there. So that's just a small detour I wanted just to get you to know, if you don't know, Spring Neo4j OGM. But given I'm talking about migration, if you don't know Spring Data Neo4j 5 or OGM, then it might not be super relevant to you. Because if you start a new project, again, start with Spring Data Neo4j 6. Unless you've got very, very strong reasons to, for instance, use embedded, and even then there are ways again to make it work with Spring Data Neo4j 6, or if you need HTTP, but that's remains to be. You basically have you have to prove that you need it. That the default should be use Spring Data Neo4j 6 unless you can prove that it cannot work in your context. That's the way I'm gonna phrase it, I guess. And so let's talk about migration now. So bye-bye OGM, bye-bye Neo4j admin, and then let's move to a small project I've done with my colleague from DevWell, Jennifer Rife, and with the supervision of Gerrit Meyer, who is co-maintainer of Spring Data Neo4j, 5, 6, and OGM as well. So it's not the same project as before. It's using the movies dataset. So, if you go to Neo4j desktop, you can do something like, maybe not on that database, but I don't know, I'm just going to use this one. Or maybe disposable, that's even greater. You can do something like play movies in the prompt, and it will import the data. So let me just show you, just so you can try it at home as well. So it's starting, and then it's based on this movies data set when you have actors, producers, movies, etc., etc. So you probably have seen that because many documentation sections within Neo4j are using that data set, because it's quite simple to understand, because movies are usually a familiar concept to people. So yeah, let me just, because it's disposable, I can just truncate everything. Boom, okay, remove stuff. Except of course I forgot to write detach. Oh no, I wrote only detach, I forgot to write delete, sorry. Okay, and then you can say something like play movies, it will play the movie guide, then you can learn about Cypher and the movie dataset, you can run those and get a small movie dataset, etc., etc. Of course, you can use Neo4j Sandbox or to get a ready-made dataset as well for an online instance of Neo4j, but you can also do it locally with Neo4j Desktop. And then you've got slides you can go through, run some queries, etc., etc. So I'm not going to do the tutorial, but yes, there are a few datasets like that you can explore with Neo4j Desktop. It's really a great onboarding material. So basically what we have right now is a classic Spring Data Neo4j 5 OGM application. So here we just have the data layer, right? We don't have any web stuff, no API over it. We just have entities. So we have an actor that has a name. We have a movie. So that's an entity actually. So the entity mapped on the movie label. We have a tagline, so we have a custom type for that. We have the release date, and we're using optimistic locking as well. So tagline is a custom type that is not supported by default, so you need to use a converter, which is this attribute converter in Spring Data Neo4j 5. I believe it's a Spring Data. Oh no, that's a Neo4j OGM thing as well, right? You've got the conversion as well. And so you've got movies, you've got tagline, etc., etc. Then you've got persons with projection. So that's something that allows you to map arbitrary data to some data types that are not entities. So in that case, we have name and born date, birth date. We have a person, which is much richer. It's a node entity, which has internal node ID, the name, birth date, and then a bunch of relationships, what movie is it directed, what movie is it acted in, what movies it reviewed, because you also have reviews like comments, notes, etc. on movies. Produce movies, it could be any of that. And we have relationship as well, so relationship entity, which is reviewed between a person and a movie. And yeah, so you get this kind of data model here. It's using Neo4j repository, so that concept still exists in Spring Data Neo4j 6, sorry, it still exists there. So it exposes everything like save, read, etc., page to page stuff. And we have some custom queries based on the naming convention of Spring Data, so that's something that is still supported today. We have custom queries, and I will come back to that in a minute, because those will need to change a little bit. And yeah, so that's about it, really. And so if we look at the test part, it's not too much different from what I've done. So test containers work very fine with JUnit 4, JUnit 5, Spring Data Neo4j 5, Spring Data Neo4j 6. And so in that case, we are doing exactly the same as I was doing in my application, right? So that part remains unchanged. So make sure to use the latest OGM. So that's true anyway, by the way. If you want to migrate to Spring Data Neo4j 6, first make sure to migrate to the latest Spring Data Neo4j 5 OGM. And so you've got that for free. So that's supported by recent-ish versions of Spring Framework. So that's something that's not new. We actually, in tests, we actually import the movies dataset. So it's equivalent to the play movies command I run in a way. And we've got several tests, just testing the basic stuff we need. And so as I was telling you, there are a few things to be aware of if you want to migrate to Spring Data Neo4j 6. First thing is, relationship entity is not a thing anymore in Spring Data Neo4j 6, so that will have to be transformed to relationship properties, and they're not going to be, if you have a repository for that, you will have to migrate it. And for that, you can use Neo4j templates, or you can use Neo4j client, or even the raw driver if needed. The rest looks kind of similar. I mean, the nodes don't have changed much. The annotation names have changed, but the annotations are quite similar to what you had before. And so if we look now, if I switch now to Spring Data Neo4j 6, we will see a few changes. So I think one of the most tricky things is understanding the custom query stuff. That's something that people usually have issues with when they start using Spring Data Neo4j 6. So if I come back to those two, so I'm just going to copy it somewhere. So file new, scratch file. Yeah, I'm just going to have it here. You see, we're trying to find a projection. So it's a query, it's annotated with query result. We can just born and name. So we match what? We match a movie per its title. And we try to find persons that acted in that specific movie. And then we return the name of that person and the birth date of that person. And we project that into this projection class with name and born. So the property names match directly. And similarly, for the other one, we basically try to find all the movies in which Tom Hanks has played. So if we look at the test for those two, you can see we have exactly this. So I'm just going to put it there. So for the first one, we have this test. For the second one, we have Tom Hanks. We have this test. And the test here looks weird, but I will tell you what it's trying to show actually. So you can see that we return, if you think in terms of pure Cypher, if we look at the query again, if I run this, again, my Neo4j database with the movies dataset, I should get as many Tom Hanks as movies he played in, right? So let me go there, let me to the browser, let me run this query and we'll see what happens. So visualization gives you this. Indeed, there is only one node in the graph, so we visualize only one Tom Hanks node. However, if you think in terms of results, that's not actually quite true. So the best way to see that is use the table view. And the table view, you will see that Tom Hanks is repeated once per row, which makes sense. As many movies as Tom Hanks acted in, we have as many rows as movies, so Tom Hanks is repeated all over the place. But you can see that Neo4j OGM, it tries to be smart and says, hey, you know what? This node, I already have it. So it should be returned only once. So when I have this list of person here, I should only get one person. I mean, the query, of course, is a bit contrived here. Like we know we match Tom Hanks, so what would we expect to list? But you will see there are some behavioral differences when we migrate to Spring Data Neo4j 6. So let me move, and I also will let me move to the new one. So now we migrate to Spring Data Neo4j 6. I need to make sure I'm up to date because I might not be. And the migration. Yeah, so I was not up to date, so I did well to do this. I'm going to trigger one build. Okay. And now let's look at the same two. So if I look again at the person repository, and the test, so now we used to have, if I look at my Scratch file, except my Scratch file is gone. Great, thank you, IntelliJ. Very clever to discard files that I need. But you can see that the test will have changed. So if we look, let's look at this one first, find my active movie titles. So we still got the same result. However, you can see the projection has changed. So you can also use classes if you want, but in that case, it's more indicated to use interfaces as long as the property matches, right? So it's a getter on the name. So in that case, you just need an interface, and you can see that when we extract the birth date and the birth year, sorry, I just keep saying birth date, but it's a year, and the name, you still get whatever you want. So interface in that case was actually enough, and that's something fully supported by Spring Data Neo4j 6. So that's one of the first difference. And then let's look at our friend Tom Hanks. And so if we look at the test, so the query has not changed, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But if we look at the test that uses it, you will see that we had one person, right, in the assertion, if you remember. We had ISAS 1. Now we've got 12. So I've not counted, but I guess we have 12 movies in there. Yes, we have 12 movies, 12 records, 12 rows of records. So that's a big difference. If you don't, you might see changes, although the query is the same. The way it's interpreted now with Spring Data Neo4j 6, and that's very important, is much closer to what the row driver does, what the Cypher data model actually is. In a way, and I think my colleague Jennifer Rife coins this. In a way, you can think of Spring Data Neo4j 5 OGM returning results like this nice little visualization here. There is only one Tom Hanks node, and there are only those 12 movies linked to it. So if we look for a list of persons, we should get only one node. Spring Data Neo4j 6 is much closer to the actual model of Cypher. It will tell you, no, there are 12 persons, right? I have 12 rows, so I have 12 persons. And so you could think, but isn't that wasteful? Like, why would we have 12 different instances of the same node? And so let's look at the test a little more. Actually, what happens, if you look at what's called the identity hash code, like the hash code of the object, the technical one, you will see that it's the same instance referenced 12 times. So Spring Data Neo4j 6 is Spring Data Neo4j 6.0.2, and I believe today we are at 6.0.7, and 6.1 is being released today as well. so this fix has been included for a long time, you will see that there are 12 instances of the same object. Not 12 instances, sorry, 12 repetitions of the same object here. So Spring Data Neo4j 6 is smart enough to not instantiate it 12 times. However, if you want to stick to the behavior that was from Spring Data Neo4j 5, which is I want to have a single person because there is a single node in the graph, what you would write instead, and that's very common thing to do when you migrate from Spring Data Neo4j 5 to Spring Data Neo4j 6, is to write this instead. If you do this, that is, match the person, aggregate the relationships, aggregate the neighbors, then you will get back to the kind of results you got with Spring Data Neo4j 5. So I would really advise you to be wary of these kind of things. I think the best way to think about it is Spring Data Neo4j 5 OGM as the point of view of the graph view of Neo4j desktop in a way, Spring Data Neo4j 6 as the table view in a way of Neo4j desktop. That's the best analogy we could come up with. So thanks, Jennifer, for that, by the way, again, because that's a really great analogy, I think. So yeah, you might end up doing this quite a lot of times when you have custom queries. Make sure if you want to hydrate your object properly to aggregate the relationships and queries, else you will end up with repeated stuff. It will be the same instance, so it's not as wasteful as one could think, but you wouldn't get a list of one person, you would get a list of 12 persons. So yes, that's a common thing to do. That's a common thing to do when you need to migrate to Spring Data Neo4j 6. So quite a difference of interpretations in terms of queries, of custom queries. And in a way, Spring Data Neo4j 6 got closer to what you would get with row driver, or what you would get with Neo4j desktop when you run something. So it's much closer to the model of Cypher, and it's not trying to be too smart about things. So I know it can be a pain to migrate to, but in a way that's for the better. That's an improvement. That's really an improvement that makes things way easier to reason about. And so we have projections, we have projection with interfaces if needed. You can, of course, resort to classes otherwise. We had a relationship before, so obviously it's not a relationship entity anymore, it's a relationship properties when you have only the target node. And what else has changed? I don't think much has changed since. It's quite similar otherwise, it's not node entity, it's node, etc., etc. So I don't think there is much more that is interesting here. Of course, you've got Spring element language configuration for parameters if you want to, with all the different syntax. So yeah, you can use spell, so spell for short, Spring element language. So you can configure stuff like this. And yes, that's a very short overview of migration issues, but one is, so to recap, and then I might show you the reactive stuff, but I don't know if that's super relevant. That's something you can do afterwards. First go from imperative to imperative and then move to reactive if you want to. Because reactive support is built in Spring Data Neo4j 6. It's a first-class citizen, so you can use the reactive variants as much as you want. And so to recap, one of the major differences between Spring Data Neo4j 6 and 5/OGM. Spring Data Neo4j 6 doesn't use OGM at all, so if you try to use node entity, so I'm going to come back to the original branch. If you try to use node entity annotations, I mean any OGM annotations, it's not going to work. It's not going to work at all because Spring Data Neo4j 6 is going to ignore that. It's just using Spring Data Neo4j 6 annotations. So they are, although they might share the same name, sometimes they are completely different. Spring Data Neo4j 6 only supports bolt. If you need HTTP, really think hard about why you need it and why bolt cannot solve the problem for you. Because usually when you need a database, you only need its query language and the protocol to talk to it. If you need something else, you might want to migrate away from that. And if you need embedded, there are some ways to make Spring Data Neo4j 6 work with embedded, but again, that's something to consider as well. Like, why do you need embedded? Is it something you really need or not? And finally, most of the feature on the feature comparison, so transport only bolt for 6, not HTTP or embedded, but the rest is kind of similar. You have, of course, conversions, you've got optimistic locking, you've got mapping from nodes to top-level entities, relationships. Nope, you have relationships properties, but not entities. So that's something to watch for. So you won't be able to use a repository for that. You might use custom queries with Neo4j template or Neo4j client. And I think I wanted to say something else, but I forgot. But yeah, so if you need to migrate, take it step by step. First, migrate to the latest Spring Data Neo4j 5 and OGM, and then migrate from there to Spring Data Neo4j 6. And be wary that Spring Boot by default now includes Spring Data Neo4j 6. So if you start a new project, you will get Spring Data Neo4j 6, which in my opinion is the right default. If you want and if you need to migrate to the most recent Spring Boot and maintain your Spring Data 5 in your application, it's also possible at the moment. It's not guaranteed in the future that it's going to work. It's going to continue to work. But for now, it might work. You might be able to use Spring Boot 2.4.x with Spring Data Neo4j 5 and OGM. And so, yeah, I think that's all I had for today, and that will conclude our long-running live stream series on Spring Data Neo4j. So I apologize for the few hiccups I've had along the weeks. I was also discovering things with you. I mean, you're learning, I'm learning, we're all learning, like the meme. And so, yeah, the front-end part slightly was a bit of a waste of time, sadly, in the end, because I didn't really get through it. But I will try to complete it and at least get the first version of the application published. Currently, it's a private repo. I will publish it at some point, hopefully soon. But I hope you learned as much as I did. I hope you enjoyed some of it even. So now you're more familiar with Spring Data Neo4j 6, its Cypher DSL integration, how to test it as well, because I always try to test drive whatever I do. So with test containers, JUnit 5, it works great. Test containers, JUnit 4, it works great. I prefer it over the Neo4j harness, test harness, which is a bit, in my opinion, fraught with risks compared to test containers. Test containers is just a container, an isolated one. Whereas a Neo4j harness, well, you need to add Neo4j to your class path, and it might conflict with some of the dependencies of your project, so that's a bit annoying. And probably less realistic, unless you're using Neo4j embedded. Usually Neo4j is not in your class path when you deploy it to your production environment. So the container in a way reflects a bit more the usual deployment topology of Neo4j applications. And yeah, so that's why I also wanted to cover a little bit about Spring Data Neo4j 5, because I know many customers, many users might have still some code there. So be wary, migrate to the latest Spring Data Neo4j 5 first, and then migrate to Spring Data Neo4j 6. You have, as I was saying at the beginning, if you need any help, we have several channels for that. We have Stack Overflow, we have Discord now, so not Slack anymore, you have Discord. Except I cannot find it anymore. And you've got the Discord, so Discord and Discord, I know it's hard to say, but community.neo4j.com. Yeah, sorry, actually in the wrong browser, that's why, but yeah. So you can find Neo4j on Discord, on Discourse, community.neo4j.com, and Stack Overflow. So yeah, as long as you remember that Spring Data Neo4j 6 does not use OGM, does not use anything from Neo4j OGM, you will already know quite a lot. So yeah, be sure to try. Don't be afraid. Try to upgrade, and it might take some time, but don't forget you have community support in all of those places, and we'll be happy to try to help you as much as we can. And be reassured that many people have tried before, so you might even find already answered questions in this course in Stack Overflow or Discord. So thanks a lot. I will stop there. It's been a pleasure talking about and live coding, even if sometimes I failed. It's been a pleasure to work with Spring Data Neo4j 6 and get some feedback from my colleagues, send them some feedback sometimes. And yeah, so next week or in 2 weeks, I mean soonish, we will go back to the beautiful world of Golang. And GoGum, for now, resumes the series we started with Eric earlier this year. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day. Stay safe during these strange times. And I hope to see you soon. So yeah, have a good one and see you later. Bye.